Yes, please. Some minutes to start. Adia, Andrés Castañeda and Rodrigo Pozo, they are graduate student from Department of History. They usually help to interpretation the different lecture. Andrés, Rodrigo, ¿pueden presentarse?
Muy buenas tardes. Good afternoon, Professor.
Good afternoon.
Adia, the idea is 10 minutes, 15 minutes after Rodrigo and Andres can share, no, his Spanish translation, no, the idea of the lecture. You can start, and after 60 minutes, can Rodrigo and Guillermo help with the Spanish translation.
Oh, okay.
And we can start in some minutes, please. The other, we are very interested in the graduate study in your university, no? The application, no? The opportunities, etc.
So should I?
After your lecture, you can get some advice to apply for your university.
Okay. Should I begin my PowerPoint now, or do you want to wait a few minutes?
In 2 minutes, please.
2 minutes. Okay.
Buenos días, por favor, atentos que a los primeros minutos de la conferencia se comparte el formato para la asistencia, nombre y el DNI, para que se pueda llevar registro en el sistema electrónico de la universidad. Y en 1 minuto comenzamos. Ante todo, muchas gracias por su tiempo, por su disponibilidad. Empezamos el seminario en enero de este año con la Universidad de Quebec o Montreal. Ahora en febrero, terminamos febrero con la conferencia de la profesora Onach de Sao Paulo University. Y en marzo tenemos universidades de Asia, Europa y Norteamérica. Buenas tardes. Un gran saludo a todos, a todas. Muchas gracias por su participación, por su presencia. Good morning, Adia. Bien, el Seminario Internacional Universidad de Desarrollo proyecta desarrollar vínculos con distintas universidades del mundo, invitando a directores académicos, a directores de centros de investigación de universidades en África, Asia, Europa, América y Oceanía. El seminario empezó el año 21 desde el vicerrectorado académico, destacando el gran apoyo, iniciativa del doctor Carlos Cabrera. Hago presente que en este año 24 tenemos pues distinguidos participantes y esta vez tenemos el honor, placer que nos acompañe la profesora Adia Whitfield. La profesora Whitfield es vicedecana del Departamento de Desarrollo en la Universidad de Washington en San Luis, en Missouri. La profesora Whitfield es una destacada socióloga reconocida por la Asociación de Sociólogos Americanos y otras distinguidas sociedades académicas internacionales. Y esperamos que su conferencia marque el inicio de actividades con esta universidad y estando atentos a la visita de la profesora Whitfield a finales de este año. Adia, thank you. Morning. We can start, please.
Great. Thank you so much. I'm gonna, I was gonna share my screen, but it says that I can't share my screen. Am I able to share the screen, or is that not?
Yes.
It is able.
Mixi, ¿nos puedes ayudar, por
Un
favor?
problema con la conexión. No puedo escuchar muy bien.
Mixi, ¿nos puedes ayudar con que Adia pueda compartir su PowerPoint?
Profesor, buenos días, ya puedo compartir pantalla de la reunión.
Adia, you can
Yes.
share your...
It says host disabled participant screen sharing.
Héctor, el que creó el Zoom tiene que dar autorización para que se pueda compartir con los asistentes. Ese es el problema.
Correcto. Mixi, ¿nos puedes ayudar, por favor? O Ever, ¿nos puedes ayudar?
Sí, profesor, ya tiene para que pueda proyectar la ponencia.
Allá, Adia,
Yes.
you can share. Yes.
Okay, thank you. Okay, hopefully you can see the slideshow. Okay, hopefully the screen is showing with the title of the presentation, which is Gray Areas, How the Way We Work Maintains Racism and What We Can Do to Fix It. So this presentation will be fairly US focused, but hopefully that's still of interest to everybody. And this stems from the research that I've been doing over the course of my career that examines racial inequality in a variety of professional occupations. Over the course of my research, I've looked at Black workers in a number of different professions, ranging from nursing to physician work to legal work, engineering, and so forth. What I wanted to do with Gray Areas, though, was to take a step back and examine some broader questions about race and inequality in the workplace in the United States, and to think about why we see such persistent inequalities. So to give a little bit of data here, if we look at the United States, our population is perhaps more racially diverse than people are sometimes aware of. For example, non-Hispanic white women constitute about 30% of the population, as do non-Hispanic white men. So white workers in total constitute 60% of our population. White citizens constitute about 60% of our population, with white men about 30%. Black men and women are about 13% total. Hispanic men and women constitute about 18% total. Asian American men and women constitute about 6% total. And the latter two groups, Latinos and Asian Americans, are actually the fastest growing demographics in the United States, with numbers that are poised to continue growing over the next 15 to 20 years. But when we look at the percent of white male workers in various jobs, particularly the most influential and high status jobs in the United States, the demographic data looks very different. As of 2017, white men were 80% of the US Congress. They were 78% of state political executives, 85% of corporate executive officers, 100% of the CEOs of Wall Street firms, 95% of Fortune 500 CEOs. In academia, my field, these numbers are not much better. They are 73% of tenured professors, 97% of the heads of venture capital firms, and 97% of the owners of television and radio licenses. So what these data show us are a pretty stark disparity between what the US population looks like and what leadership and influence looks like when we're talking about organizations and work in the US. So this presents a disparity that I try to focus on and try to understand better in Gray Areas. We know, for example, that when we take a survey of the landscape of work and race today, that on one hand, we see some pretty significant progress. That as of the last 60 years, we have seen the outlawing of explicit legal racial discrimination as a result of the 1964 Civil Rights Act that outlawed racial discrimination in public and private settings. Since then, we've also seen the growth and rise of a multi-billion-dollar DEI industry. That's workers who are focused on advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion in various spaces, in workplaces, organizations, schools, and so forth. And maybe most importantly, we know that these ideas around diversity are supported in large part by many workers. Workers of all races report an interest in wanting to work in environments that address diversity. This comes from Black, white, Asian American, Latinx workers writ large. There's a pretty sizable shift in the spoken and explicit interest in wanting to have more diverse workplaces. There is an industry that seeks to support this, and there's the absence of federal legislation that would prohibit it. At the same time, we know that Black workers remain underrepresented in leadership roles across industries, as was evident from the data that I showed on the earlier slides. We also know that Black workers are subject to significant racial wage gaps that do not grow smaller with more education and cannot be attributed to things like gaps in experience, skill level, job type, and so forth. Black workers instead are concentrated in lower status occupations with little job security and few prospects for mobility. So what I wanted to tackle with this project was to think about how it's possible that both these things can be true. How do we have a society in the US where explicit discrimination is outlawed? There is a cultural support for diversity, equity, and inclusion. There's an industry that's grown up around advancing it, but yet we see so little progress when it comes to Black workers moving ahead and moving into leadership positions, but also moving into jobs that allow for the closure of some racial wage gaps and for the economic disparities that are present along racial lines. So the book asks this question of why. Why do we see these disparities present when diversity is this multi-billion-dollar industry? Why do these inequalities persist 50 plus years after the landmark Civil Rights Act of 1964? Why do the top ranks of so many industries fail to reflect an increasingly racially diverse population? What I posit in gray areas are a few things that this is not because of, and one thing that I argue it is because of. It is not because there is a lack of qualified Black workers. We know that as a result of advancement in education, and advancements in some forms of mobility, there are a number of Black workers who are qualified, highly educated, interested in moving into these types of professional occupations. It is not, again, because we still live in a society that is characterized by legal explicit racial discrimination. What I argue in this book, however, is that what we can see to explain, or what we can identify to explain these disparities, is that the way we work is actually serving to maintain racial inequality, and that the aspects associated with how we are working are contributing to why we see these disparities continuing to remain present in our workplaces today. So when I talk about the way we work perpetuating racial inequality, what I refer to here are what I call in the book the gray areas of work. And the gray areas of work refer not to the explicitly stated parts of one's job, but the social, cultural, and relational aspects associated with work that often go unspoken, undefined, and unregulated, but yet are areas that are thrive for racial inequality to persist. These are the parts of our job that involve making close relationships with colleagues who may aid our advancement up the corporate ladder. These are the parts of our jobs that associate or that determine how we know about work in the first place, or how we understand the organizational culture in a given environment so that we can conform to it and make sure that we are not in violation in ways that can hurt us. Again, these are often parts of our jobs that are pretty taken for granted, but are not usually specified and clearly identified. And as a result, they have the propensity for racial inequality to persist. What I'll talk about in the book and through this presentation are the ways that these gray areas are replicated, or present rather, in hiring, in organizational culture, and in advancement. The book focuses explicitly on how each of these processes are structured, on the norms and expectations associated with each, how these areas are constructed in ways that can exclude and disadvantage Black workers, and perhaps most importantly, the presentation in the book will focus on how we can do better and how we can shift our organizations to become ones that are not subject to these gray areas that facilitate inequalities remaining present. In order to address this topic more fully, the book follows the stories of 7 Black workers in very different and divergent fields. And this is to get a sense of being able to follow these workers through their occupational journeys, but also to understand how the gray areas of work have an impact on them in different employment settings and in different ways. The book follows Constance, who is a chemical engineer, Kevin, a nonprofit worker at an education-focused nonprofit, Brian, a film producer and executive, Max, an emergency medicine doctor, Alex, who's doing gig work primarily for Uber Eats, Amalia, who is a journalist, and Darren, who is a financial executive. And each of these workers represents a different facet of the US economy, but also highlights different ways in which aspects of our economy replicate these gray areas and maintain them in ways that can make it very challenging for Black workers. So I want to start the discussion with this question of hiring. When it comes to hiring, research shows that hiring managers basically receive more applications in a given day than they can ever adequately spend time really delving into and reading closely. So what often happens with hiring managers is that they rely on the process of telling a story. They create a narrative about potential candidates and applicants to try to make them make sense and to try to figure out where they may or may not fit into the company. Now, we also know from the work of some economists that when hiring managers engage in telling a story, they may sometimes rely back on discriminatory processes. There is statistical discrimination, wherein people draw from information that is generally statistically true broadly about a group, but may not necessarily be applicable in a given case. And there is preferential discrimination, where people are drawing not from information that is generally true, but from their own tastes and preferences for or against a certain group. We know that when hiring managers rely on these types of discrimination, they may be less likely to identify Black workers as people for whom they want to move forward in the hiring process. What we know most about the way that current hiring works in the US is that social networks, the connections, the relationships, the webs that people have with each other become critical mechanisms in how people find access to jobs, with upwards of 75% of our jobs being secured today by the relationships that we already have with other people in our networks and through our connections. Now, this may seem pretty straightforward, right? It's a question of how who you know matters as much as what you know. But this question of how hiring becomes driven through social networks and existing connections and relationships can actually become very troubling and a bit disadvantageous when we consider how much our social networks in the US often remain very racially homogenous, with upwards of 70% of white respondents in a recent 2014 survey stating that they had no close friends at all who were people of color. So when we rely on social networks to determine who has access to jobs, this creates a perhaps unintentional barrier that can create problems for Black workers moving into various positions. The example that I want to use to illustrate this here is from Constance. And Constance, as I mentioned, is one of the respondents in the study. She is a professor of chemical engineering. Constance has degrees from some of the top universities in the United States. She's very well trained, very highly academically qualified. And even still, Constance acknowledged that networks got her in the door to her current job. She had a lot of doubts about herself upon finishing her PhD. She wasn't sure that she had the capabilities and the skills to continue doing research over the course of her career, and the idea of coming up with new projects constantly and being that type of researcher seemed daunting and intimidating. But her networks mattered in a couple of ways. For one thing, her dissertation advisor strongly encouraged her. And he said, I know that it sounds like a daunting career, but at least try to apply for something at an R1, start there, see where that takes you, and then you can reconsider if you feel like it's not working out. The second way that her social networks mattered was that her advisor also leveraged his connections to vouch for her, something that she found out later on in the process. So when she was being interviewed for her job, her advisor went out of his way to proactively contact some people that he knew in her department to reassure them that she would be a good fit, to reassure them that she could do the job and that she would be a person that they would not regret hiring. What happened with Constance, however, was that when she started her job, she inadvertently ended up changing her specialty areas. And that required rebuilding her networks on her own and losing a lot of what we call social capital that she was able to rely on from her advisor's previous relationships with her. And so for Constance, being in the position where she had to rebuild her networks all on her own really identified how much these networks matter and how much they worked to her detriment when it came to succeeding in her work. And here are some quotes from Constance that highlight this. She told me, moving into her new job, all the credit I had for being Professor Smith's student, I lost. I went into a new field. No one knew my advisor. The fact that I came out of his group didn't mean anything to them. I was starting over from scratch with no one to vouch for me. That has been my challenge ever since. And when I asked Constance to elaborate on how she had tried to navigate the experience of rebuilding her networks and why that mattered so much, she told me, going to meet people, get in the in crowd, because I'm introverted anyway, on top of being a Black woman, while not being known, it has been terrible. I hate it. If it was just based on merit, if the networks didn't matter so much, I'd be much better positioned. But the networks are what's missing. So I missed out on all kinds of things: awards, nominations, proposals. And the final quote from Constance that I'll underscore involves her describing the moment where the importance of these networks really hit her and landed home for her. She told me, I was at a conference and there was a guy presenting there, and he talked about how research collaborations depend on personal relationships with people. You ask yourself, would I spend time with this person? Is this someone I want to have dinner with? When he said that, I was just devastated, because who in this room wants to have dinner with me? And this is why I haven't had any collaborations with anybody since grad school. because I haven't done this. So what we can see from Constance's quotes here is that she's in this process of rebuilding networks in a field where she is very much significantly underrepresented as a Black woman in chemical engineering. But this process and this need to have these networks and have these relationships in order to be nominated for awards, in order to be someone who's well positioned for achieving certain proposals, in order to be someone who's likely to get her grants funded and her research funded, not having those networks and not having those connections has really worked to her detriment. Not because she doesn't have the skills, not because she's not able to do chemical engineering effectively, but because the social parts of her work are outsized and significant in ways that make it more challenging for Black women in fields where they are so underrepresented to build those relationships in ways that facilitate their success. So the costs of networking are that when networks and connections drive hiring, Black workers can easily lose out. Moving into these networks can be harder for them. And as Constance's example shows us, building networks from scratch is particularly challenging. For Black women in male-dominated fields, these difficulties are exacerbated by the challenges that are associated with trying to bridge these racial and gender gaps and form these connections in fields where those relationships may not necessarily be quite so easy. To talk about organizational culture, this is a reference to the norms, expectations, and values that
Aria,
are. Yes.
We can start to the Spanish. Andrés, ¿me escuchas?
Sí, profesor.
¿Nos puedes ayudar, please?
Por
Please,
supuesto.
Adia, to the help the Andrés to the Spanish. Sí, Andrés, puedes comenzar.
Gracias, profesor. Entonces, lo que la profesora aquí está tratando de hablar acerca de su investigación, acerca de de la inequalidad racial en las carreras para los trabajadores de raza negra y también sus profesiones, sobre todo cuando se trata en áreas tal vez de enfermería, de trabajo legal, ingeniería. Al final de cuentas menciona como un tipo de áreas grises, donde supuestamente, si se puede dar un paso atrás, se puede ver de que hay todavía inequalidad racial que aún persiste. Ahora, también mostró unos gráficos mostrando la población en los Estados Unidos, mostrando que era una población muy diversa, que aún así el 60% son blancos, el 13% negros, 18% hispanos, 6% asiáticos, y cómo los latinos y asianoamericanos tienden a crecer más rápido en realidad. Y si incluso se ve entonces cómo se ve el porcentaje, también trata de mostrar cómo supuestamente hay una inequalidad debido a que la mayoría de los que tienen posiciones de liderazgo son blancos, supuestamente. También muestra de que ha habido grandes avances para igualdad legal, sobre todo la Acta de Derechos Civiles de 1964, el crecimiento de lo que se le conoce como DEI, una organización clásica que trata de forzar igualdad, y cómo trabajadores de diferentes razas tratan de mostrar interés en sitios donde haya más diversidad. Y también, sin embargo, está diciendo de que aún hay supuestamente como diferencias en las ganancias que se hacen debido a raza, supuestamente, como no hay muchos en posiciones de liderazgo. Y empieza a preguntarse por qué esto es verdad, por qué hay desigualdad, sobre todo a pesar de todos los avances. Y ella menciona que no cree que se trata debido a discriminación legal como antes, sino de que es la forma en cómo supuestamente se trabaja que mantiene una igualdad racial. En este caso, estas serían las áreas grises que ella menciona en el problema para contratar, una cultura de organización, avance y cómo se estructura, cuáles son las normas y las expectativas. Al fin de cuentas menciona cómo una de las cosas muy importantes serían las conexiones. O sea, al fin de cuentas es quién conoces y no cómo hace su trabajo que importa, supuestamente. Y ella sigue entonces la idea de 7 diferentes personas de diferentes ámbitos económicos con diferentes trabajos y mostrando cómo es que al final de cuentas estas diferentes áreas grises no les ayudan, no les benefician. Empezando con las prácticas de contratación, menciona cómo Constance, una de ellas, que era una ingeniera química, estuvo estudiando para obtener su maestría, su doctorado. Cuando trató de ingresar a una nueva posición, el problema fue tanto que tuvo que usar una conexión de un amigo que le ayudó para ingresar. pero para ello tuvo que hacer un cambio también de lo que ella estaba estudiando y por ello tuvo que abandonar algunas otras conexiones que tenía para empezar nuevamente. Y ahí, como estaba en un nuevo ámbito sin conexiones, al parecer no tenía mucho con quién podía relacionarse, con quién poder hablar. Entonces, es con un nuevo campo, nuevas experiencias, nueva orientación, no estuvo una posición muy buena como al principio. Ahora va a empezar a hablar acerca de la cultura organizacional.
Thank you, Adrian.
Should I
Yes.
keep going?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. So the second part I'll discuss is organizational culture. And organizational culture refers to the norms, expectations, and values of a given company. The basic expectations for how workers will interact, the things that are held dear, the values that are part of the company culture. But organizational culture is rarely created with Black workers in mind, and organizational norms instead often encourage colorblindness. But we also know that ostensibly race-neutral environments make it very difficult for Black workers to describe the challenges that they face. These challenges can include overt harassment, meaning workplaces that tolerate racial slurs, or these challenges can include subtle biases, such as a focus on how well workers fit into the environment or diversity talk that avoids race. And the examples that I'll give here to underscore are from Brian. Brian is a film producer that I interviewed, and he had worked for a period of time at a studio that encouraged innovation and new ideas, and that was part of why he was hired for the position that he held. The studio mentioned that they wanted to focus on bringing in people who could champion new projects and touch parts of culture and bring in ideas that they had not previously covered, and that they were very open and welcome to hearing about him bringing in ideas that told stories about various aspects of Black life and Black communities. But Brian also found that when he tried to bring these ideas to higher ups and to supervisors, they often used market logics that justified an aversion to films with Black leads, casts, and directors. In short, they summed up their aversion with the statement, "These films just don't make money." This is actually inaccurate, and these claims ignore Black consumer audience buying power and the fact that films that have more diverse casts actually tend to outperform those that do not. And he also noted that this was selectively applied to Black but not white filmmakers, where Black filmmakers who directed projects that did not meet box office expectations usually were not given second chances, which was not the case for many white filmmakers. So when I asked Brian to share more details, here are some of the quotes that he told me. He told me, in describing the organizational culture of the studio where he was employed, everything most people think about vis-a-vis Black filmmaking, all of their assumptions about how the system is rigged against them, and the majority of Black people think that in Hollywood, those assumptions were proven correct. This is a company that values innovation, values loyalty, values taking initiative, so it claims. But the studio heads put values online that are not espoused. And so Brian goes on to share some examples of how he came to realize this discrepancy between what the studio heads said they wanted in terms of opportunities to promote diversity among film and stories about Black life and experience versus what they were actually willing to greenlight and bankroll. He told me in one case where he was trying to champion a project that he felt could really be a great vehicle for the studio, the executive who ultimately took the meeting had shown a lack of interest in what I thought were particularly salient Black-centered projects by celebrated Black writers before. This is the person who passed on Moonlight when it was a project we could have made. And Moonlight, just by way of aside, is a film that came out, I believe in 2018 or 2019, that ended up winning an Academy Award for Best Picture. So it was a celebrated story about aspects of a young Black person's life. Anyway, he took the meeting with this filmmaker with me. Then the following day suggested to our boss that we pass on the project, but admitted in that email that he had not read the screenplay nor seen the Sundance winning film. So Brian went on to explain further his frustration with this type of logic and argument. He told me, then he used the psychology that one normally uses in Hollywood to create fear of missing out on one's boss. Usually that logic is, there are other parties bidding on it, so if you don't trust your taste, trust others. He used that to sell not bidding. In a crowded biopic field, this would be a tough one to win. Bidding would drive up the price, it would be overvalued. This is a logic he never uses for projects that involve white people. So Brian's quotes here underscore his frustration with the organizational culture in his workplace and how, despite being at a place where leadership in the company purported to want to support diversity and claimed that they wanted to introduce a diversity of voices in their filmmaking projects, still were held in thrall by an organizational culture that emphasized a market-based colorblind culture that allowed them to highlight and elevate their perceptions about the limitations of Black films in ways that made it difficult, if not impossible, for Brian actually to do the job that he was hired to do, which was to advance these types of projects. The colorblind market-based culture took precedence and prevented Brian from being able to bring these types of films to light. So when we talk about issues in organizational culture, things to keep in mind are that they often obscure the patterns that reproduce racial inequalities. They make it harder to address and discuss these issues. In some cases, the focus on diversity may result in attention to gender, opinion, viewpoint, factors other than race. But for Brian, we see specifically that this organizational culture served to marginalize him as a Black worker, constraining his ability to contribute to organizational goals. This can increase alienation and risks of turnover, which was the case for Brian, who ended up leaving the company shortly after a few more false starts like what he described in his interview. So I'm gonna go to advancement next. Do you want to translate what I said before I move on? Or should I keep going?
I think I can translate what you said now.
Okay, perfect.
La siguiente parte es cultura organizacional, que básicamente se refiere a las expectativas y a las normas y valores de la compañía en donde uno trabaja. Expectativas acerca de cómo uno debe trabajar, los valores de la compañía y su cultura. Y para este ejemplo muestra el señor Brian que supuestamente es una persona que trabaja en Hollywood para hacer películas y menciona cómo supuestamente ante este ámbito, aunque supuestamente se decía que se valoraba la creatividad de una persona, diferentes valores, qué es lo que se puede traer, él menciona de que en realidad no es así, porque más que nada muchas veces él trata de poner sus ideas al frente, pero les dicen que esos tipos de películas que él trata de poner no producen dinero. Supuestamente películas que él quería poner que usaban más, bueno, culturas distintas o se podría decir basadas en color negro de la piel o algo así. Y él menciona que esto era aplicado selectivamente para personas de color negro, no blanco, y empezamos a hablar acerca de más detalles entre ellos, acerca de cómo el sistema usualmente en realidad tiende a empujar más hacia abajo para personas que de diferente color, y parece que hay un menor interés también en películas que tratan de enfocarse en la cultura racial de ellos. Y cómo esto en realidad muestra que hay una falta de interés también en este tipo de películas por parte de los ejecutivos, los que están enfrente, sobre todo cuando se trata en un momento de tratar de vender para este guión llamado Moonlight, que se trata de una persona de color, pero no querían hacerlo y tuvieron que hacer todo un tipo de intercambio para que finalmente se pudiera lograr que la vieran y para que se pudiera hacer, lo cual supuestamente no hubiera ocurrido, de acuerdo a él, no hubiera ocurrido si es que hubiera sido otro tipo, si hubiera sido otro tipo de productor o director. Y entonces menciona cómo, a pesar de que quieren tratar de apoyar la diversidad, el mercado en realidad está basado más en un tipo de cultura bajo color, donde no se pone mucho esfuerzo en supuestamente películas negras en realidad. Y aunque trata de mostrar diferentes tipos de proyectos, siempre parece ser de que no se puede lograr tanto en lo que se quería. Se muestra entonces de que la cultura organizacional trata de ocultar un patrón que produce inigualdad racial. Es más difícil de poder tratar de hablar de estos problemas, marginaliza a un grupo de personas y supuestamente también tiende a enfocarse más en diferentes tipos de diversidad que en la racial.
Okay, thank you. So finally, moving on to advancement. In most US workplaces, advancement is rarely driven by transparent, clearly defined goals and criteria. Instead, it's largely subjective and opaque, and very heavily influenced by relationships with supervisors and managers. So in most cases, while there is a kind of cultural mythology that people will advance in a corporation based on being able to be the best worker or to bring in the most money, that's actually often not what happens. It's often very unclear how one advances to the next rung of the career ladder. But we do know that having a strong relationship with someone in a supervisory role is a significant factor in the extent to which someone is willing or able to advance. We also know, however, that Black workers report the most distance from their supervisors, despite having interest and motivation in career mobility, and that they are often steered away from divisions that are tracks to management roles, particularly if we're talking about corporate sectors and their ability to head divisions that result in a profit and loss. So when it comes to advancement, the quotes that I'll use here are from Kevin. And Kevin is an interesting case because he is a former banker who moved to nonprofit work. And this meant that he moved from very male-dominated environments in banking and finance to very women-dominated environments in nonprofit work and education. Kevin expected that moving to the nonprofit sector and education in particular would dramatically shift the type of organizational culture and advancement opportunities to which he was exposed, but he found that there were similar challenges in both places. Specifically, in the nonprofit sector, he was at a place where his advancement possibilities he felt had stalled. And when I asked him to explain why he felt there were these kind of blocked pathways, he argued that in many cases, managers described not seeing him as a leader, and instead, they slotted him into roles that fit their preconceived notions of where they felt that he belonged in the organizational system. He felt that distant relationships with his supervisors, who were mostly white women, made it hard for him to transcend these challenges. And this resulted in a lot of frustration and a feeling of stalled mobility for him in his career ladder. So when I asked him to detail a bit about these challenges, he told me, when it comes to advancement, I have been frustrated. I have been blocked. I feel hampered by white women in terms of where I've gone and what they think I should do. In a nutshell, I would say that has been my consistent problem. When asked to give me more information about how this problem manifested, especially when it came to advancement, he told me, it's the same every time I'm managed by a white woman. They're initially nice and friendly, yet we have no rapport. So then when I need feedback, it's obtuse, given with a side eye, we have this impasse, and then I feel like I need to leave because I feel like I'm going to be fired. If I work with a Black woman, I succeed, get feedback, do well. At another job, I was managed by a Black man and a white man. That was always good, fine. But in the nonprofit space, it is a world of mostly white women. I believe I'm speaking the story of many other Black men in nonprofits or education who have to hide or disfigure themselves or they would be kicked out the door. And when asked to clarify about what this hiding or this disfigurement meant, he told me, it's a whole balancing act where I'm trying to modulate my voice, my behavior, and it's hard because I want to be an ally, but if I'm a normal Black guy who doesn't read up on those things, that you always have to be non-threatening, that you have to use a certain voice, then I'm not going to succeed because I'm not going to advance. So Kevin's quotes here underscore the significance and the significance of relationships with supervisors and managers and the ways that they can be fraught in ways that for Black men in these particular spaces, fraught by ways that make it very difficult to form the types of close supervisory relationships that are necessary for advancement. Kevin describes difficulty getting feedback. He describes difficulty with management, with supervisory interactions. Again, these difficulties do not reflect a lack of interest in promotion or advancement, but what they do reflect are the ways for Black men working, again, predominantly in environments dominated by white women can experience these types of challenges, even from groups who themselves experience some broader disparities in the labor market. So to sum up this section, invisible barriers to advancement include the fact that managers are decisive in determining who moves into leadership. But for Black workers, undefined ideas of fit can be a hindrance that require extensive work to offset. As Kevin's case shows us, race and gender can make some workers seem like less of a match for leadership roles, and that white women, even though they are also a member of disadvantaged groups in the workplace, being similarly underrepresented in leadership, can actually seem to present obstacles for other underrepresented workers in cases like this, where they may not be able to see Black workers and Black men workers in particular as people who are also kind of management material, for lack of a better word. So the next, I'll summarize, I think, and then if you want to translate, I guess we can do that before I move to the final slide, which will be suggestions for things organizations can do differently. But to sum up what I've said thus far, I've tried to show that everyday aspects of how we work contain numerous pitfalls and obstacles for Black workers. When it comes to hiring, the reliance on social networks sidelines Black applicants and employees. When it comes to organizational culture, a race-neutral climate can make it much harder to see the patterns that facilitate disparities. And when it comes to advancement, managers have outsized role in promotion, yet experience more distance from Black workers. In sum, how we work contributes to racial inequality. Should I stop there before moving to the final slide?
Sí, está bien. Yes, I am really interpret. Thank you. En la siguiente sección, la señora entonces habla acerca de lo que se podría decir para poder avanzar o para poder subir la escalera cuando se trata de trabajos, para ser promovidos. Menciona cómo esto está, aunque en un principio esto se ve que está dirigido claramente por objetivos y criterio, en realidad se ve que es muy subjetivo y es muy influenciado por las relaciones que uno tiene con los supervisores o los administradores incluso. Pero menciona también cómo los trabajadores de colores negros mencionan que tienen mucha distancia de sus supervisores y en ocasiones son conducidos o dirigidos a diferentes trabajos en divisiones, los cuales no dan oportunidades para que sean promovidos a nuevos trabajos en administración. Ahora, hace el ejemplo de este otro trabajador que cambió su labor de ser un banquero a trabajo de no lucro en realidad, donde encontró diferentes desafíos. Y menciona cómo su promoción en este tipo de trabajos tendió a ser como un poco lenta y luego simplemente hubo un pare en el que no pudo avanzar más en realidad. Y cuando se le preguntó el por qué, él menciona de que los administradores no tienden a verlo como una persona que pueda ser un líder. Y también menciona diferentes relaciones que son muy lejanas a los supervisores en realidad. Cuando trata de hablar con ellos, se ve que tienen a veces que evadirle, no querer hablar o simplemente darle algunos consejos que son demasiado obtusos o muy vagos en realidad. Y menciona cómo esto refleja que es un ambiente laboral que está dominado por mujeres de color blanco y cómo estos administradores tienden a ser muy decisivos cuando se trata de de quién se trata de un líder, pero no lo ven mucho a él o a personas de color negro como a alguien que pueda avanzar. Él menciona que cuando habla con mujeres de color negro en realidad tiende a obtener mejores respuestas o respuestas más claras también. Entonces, aquí se puede mencionar de que los aspectos de día a día mencionan problemas para los trabajadores de color negro, como puede haber problemas entre géneros también, porque en realidad las mujeres como tienden a no tener mucha proporción en el trabajo, también no tienden a apoyar mucho a él. Y es un poco difícil para tratar de encontrar, para poder también contratar, porque usualmente se tiende a poner demasiado apoyo, entonces en las relaciones sociales que tienden a poner de lado a trabajadores y aplicantes de color negro, y también los aspectos diarios de cómo se trabaja, también hay muchos hoyos y obstáculos para trabajadores de color negro, como lo menciona aquí, y también entonces está mencionando que cómo se trabaja entonces contribuye para la inigualdad racial. Ahora vamos a pasar entonces a las partes en donde se menciona cómo es que se puede hacer para poder solucionar este problema.
Thank you. So I'm going to conclude with is kind of my favorite part of the presentation, which is solutions and talking about the things that organizations can do. I've described ways that the gray areas of work contribute to racial inequality, focusing on hiring, organizational culture, and advancement. But research does document that organizations don't have to fall prey to these same patterns, and that there are shifts that companies can take to help try to minimize and alleviate the ways in which gray areas perpetuate racial inequality. For one thing, when it comes to hiring, organizations can expand past existing social networks to other outlets. Research has shown that when companies consider historically Black colleges and universities or Hispanic serving institutions as places from which they recruit alongside the other ones from which they are already recruiting, they open their eyes and their awareness to a world of talent and potential entry-level workers that are previously outside of their social networks that they never knew about. In other words, hiring and expanding social networks to include places that serve a broad number of underrepresented workers is a pretty straightforward but easy way to attract more of these underrepresented workers into an organization. When it comes to organizational culture, I recommend that organizations replace race-neutral cultures with race-conscious cultures. And there are a variety of ways to do this. There can be small steps that include avoiding dress and appearance codes that disproportionately impact Black workers. So for example, eliminating dress or appearance codes that ban hairstyles like cornrows or dreadlocks or braids or things that are more likely to be associated with Black workers. On a more complex level, organizations can also become more race conscious by empowering diversity managers and making sure that they have the resources, support, and leadership positions to be able to keep an eye on what the entire organization is doing and to implement solutions that can help to redress these issues. And finally, when it comes to advancement, organizations can institute mentoring programs for all rather than those that are invitation only or just occur organically. Companies can also establish and leaders can join a diversity task force, and these have been documented to do a lot more good than mandatory diversity training because they pull in people from the variety of levels in an organization and task them with identifying problems and implementing solutions. And finally, companies can provide clarity and transparency around expectations for promotions. So while I've spent a lot of time in this presentation identifying and highlighting the challenges that are present for Black workers as a result of the gray areas, I want to conclude by emphasizing that there are steps that organizations can take. There is research-backed evidence that documents that these gray areas don't have to be an issue for Black workers. There are ways that we can think about trying to make our organizations more equitable and more fair and more open to a variety of workers in ways that reflect the demographics of our population, so that hopefully in the future, when we look at the slides that document what our population looks like and what the leadership of companies looks like, there is a lot more mismatch and overlap than there is disconnect. So I'm going to stop the screen share at that point, and I'm happy to allow for the translation and take any questions or thoughts that people have.
Ahora, entre las formas en cómo puede tratar de solucionarse estos problemas, lo primero sería tratar de expandir más allá de las relaciones sociales para diferentes formas, tal vez viendo más los currículos o tratar de revisar también en diferentes oportunidades que se puedan encontrar en colegios, pero en fin de cuentas no basarnos completamente en nuestras redes sociales y en lo que conocemos de nuestros compañeros en realidad. También propone que se reemplace raza neutral con conciencia de raza, supuestamente, en el cual menciona que, por ejemplo, en vez de tratar de poner, un ejemplo que está poniendo es de que en vez de tratar de evitar de que no usen un estilo de cultura negra para su cabello, se le permita usar ello, y también dar más poder a los administradores de diversidad. Tal vez una cosa más que también apoya sería programas para ayudar a diferentes trabajadores que recién están ingresando, entonces para que puedan tener a alguien que les pueda demostrar cómo funciona todo, qué se tiene que hacer antes de que ya los puedan dejar entrar para elaborar también. Y tratar de establecer un grupo que ayude para la diversidad también. También estaba proponiendo de que se trate de una transparencia clara para todo tipo de expectativas para que uno pueda ser promovido, o sea, para que se pueda de esa manera saber qué uno tiene que hacer para ser promovido, en vez de dejarle simplemente es para que sea subjetivo para los administradores. Y con esto es lo que termina entonces la profesora y estaría abriendo para las preguntas que tengan.
Well, Adia, the African American experience, for example, in Missouri, I can read there are 10 and 60% the African American population in Missouri State. The idea is how connect your research with the university experience, no? In Washington, University in St. Louis, how you connect with this African American experience in university, between student, between professor, the experience, not only the African American, could be an example, the Asian American in your university in last 20th century, no? The people know in 50 is a challenge, the American society to Afro-American people, no? Because in the south of the state has the law, no? The law, there are many laws against the Afro-American people. In the 60s, the situation changed, but how this national change affect or has experienced at your university?
Yeah, I think the way that it has affected the changes at the university has been that the laws that allowed racial discrimination to persist are no longer present. And what that's meant at my university, Washington University in St. Louis, is that there has been an increase in the number of African-American students who matriculate at the university. There has been an increase in the number of African-American faculty who are employed at the university. And I think that's a direct result of the eradication of laws that prohibited their presence at the university. Where I would say that there is still room for growth and development is making sure that students who come here and the faculty who come here have support from the university that allows them to do their best work and to thrive. And I think that's an area where the university continues to try to make sure that they are meeting the moment.
Adia, the Afro-American, the Afro-Peruvian is a common topic between our university. Understand this process, the social process. I read your university has a program with the Fudan University. Our university has agreement with Fudan University, Shanghai University, and the last year some students, the Fudan visit our university. I developed a program with this university, no? The China, no? The China is a common experience for your university in Missouri and this university in Lima. We can find different common topics within Missouri and Lima. To project, no? Continue this change, this activity. Well, amigos, amigas, ¿tienen algún comentario, alguna pregunta para Adia? Andrés, ¿tienes alguna pregunta?
Bueno, sí, en realidad tengo una pregunta aquí. Bueno, cuando I do have a question, if I may. I'm sorry, I thought in Spanish and spoke in Spanish. My question is this: when you started mentioning about I think his name was Brian, the person who was working in Hollywood, I think you said, with the movies. You mentioned that he was trying to put forward movies about Black culture. Is that correct? Or was he trying to put movies that had Black characters or Black aspects? Because I think there's a difference between both. So before I do my question, I would like to clarify: was he trying to put forward movies of Black culture or Black characters?
So actually, some of both. Brian's idea was that he was very driven by wanting to expand the representation of Black people on film. So he wanted to bring forth stories that shared the nuance and the diversity and breadth of aspects of Black communities and Black life. And in doing so, he also wanted to make sure that he was offering opportunities to tell stories that featured Black actors, empower Black directors, and so forth. And this was something he made very clear in the interview process, and something that the studio told him that they valued and that they wanted to see him do. He was told that was an important part of what he was bringing to the company.
Thank you. So my question is this: considering that Hollywood, let's say, Hollywood and the film industry tends to be a very subjective industry. And even when sometimes people think this is the next blockbuster, when they put it to film, sometimes it ends up being a flop. Could it be possible then that his experience may have been more of, not so much as, I am putting you down because of the color of your skin and your ideas that are of Black culture, but more of your idea is bad because it's just bad, not because it's Black, but because it's bad?
So the story that he was given by leadership was that not so much that the idea was bad, but that the idea is not going to sell, right? That what you're bringing forward isn't going to make any money. It's not going to sell because we know that Black films tend not to sell. What makes that more of a challenge, though, is that the data actually contradicts that point, right? So we know that films that actually have more diversity below the line in terms of the crew, in terms of the casting, in terms of how the film gets put together, actually tend to outperform those that don't at the box office. So the frustration for Brian was not so much that he kind of never thought that he could possibly have a bad idea, or that he never thought that he could potentially bring something that wouldn't be considered a solid idea. The frustration for him was that the ideas that he was bringing forth were being dismissed based on erroneous assumptions and incorrect information. And it became more frustrating when ideas that he brought forth to the studio were passed on by the studio, but then went on to be made by other studios and became enormous blockbusters. And for him, that was part of the evidence that it wasn't that he was bringing stories that wouldn't sell. It was that the studio was being cautious and timid and relying on inaccurate information to justify not moving forward. That was why I gave the example of the film Moonlight. Moonlight was made with I don't know if people are familiar with it or happen to see it. It's an American movie, but it was an American movie with a predominantly Black cast and storyline that, as I said, went on to win Best Picture at the Academy Awards, which in the US is a huge thing, and earned well above its earned well above its budget. Yes. So he offers that as an example of the type of project that he consistently was bringing to the studio heads, only to find them dismissing it and to see that work go on to be replicated or to see that work successfully move on to other studios.
So
Francis?
it wasn't so much then, so although he brought forth his idea and the studio heads rejected it, other studios saw the value of it and accepted it.
Yes. Which just added to his frustration because he was hired to be the person bringing those ideas to the studio where he was employed, only to see them rely on inaccurate information not to support those ideas and for other studios to pick them up and to run with it.
Well, and forgive me if I'm saying this, ma'am, but that then sounds to me that it's not so much a problem of race, but a problem of studio heads being just dumb. As we have seen other studios that saw and said, yeah, this is a good idea, let's go for it.
I think both things can be true. I think it can be a problem of studio heads being dumb and also studio heads being blinded to the diversity of the types of experiences that are going to sell, particularly if those are ideas that are grounded in aspects of Black culture and Black community.
Good point then. So when you mention Black culture, and you'll forgive me for this because once more, I am not too familiar with Black culture in the US. But from what I've seen, in different movies when they try to portray Black culture, it tends to be focused more on crime. And I apologize if it sounds a bit too much like that. It tends to focus too much on crime, on putting an overemphasis on heroism on criminals, if I can say. So is that something that really should be, I don't know, shown or glorified?
So it's funny that you asked that because that was actually one of the frustrations that Brian had as well about his experience in Hollywood. Part of his frustration was that there is such a breadth and diversity of aspects of Black culture and Black community that don't get shown because there is much more of a comfort, in his view, from studio heads to show the aspects of Black life that do focus on crime, right? The story of Moonlight that I keep mentioning is a coming of age story of a working class guy who kind of grows up and develops into, it's his journey into adulthood. That's one example of a type of story that presents a very different picture than I think what we had seen in many cinematic representations. But there are also stories, for example, there's a film called The Best Man, and this is a bit older. It came out in, I want to say 2000, I think. And it was a story of several upwardly mobile Black professionals who were coming together for a wedding. It's kind of a comedy drama about some secrets that they have from their college years that get unearthed when they all return for this wedding. There's nothing in there about crime or anything like that. It did particularly well at the box office. It was another example of a film that told a particular story about Black life that actually overperformed relative to expectations. But yet it still, despite performance that was on par with that of other early filmmakers, the director struggled to make a sequel, which again suggests some lack of commonalities between his experience and other first-time directors who were able to direct sequels based on outperforming box office expectations. There are other films, and I mentioned some of these in the book as well. Girls Trip is a more recent example of a story of four Black women in early middle age who go to New Orleans, an American city, for a certain festival. And it's a comedy that shows just their experiences and their friendship and how it matters. There's nothing in there about crime. And that's part of Brian's point, that there's so much of aspects of Black life and Black culture and Black experiences that often doesn't get told because of the singular focus on aspects of crime and violence and glorification of criminal life. Brian was hired to bring those stories to bear at the studio. But his experiences in trying to do so were consistently thwarted by this market-based logic that relied on assuming that these stories would not make money, even when leaders were not familiarizing themselves with the story or making it a point to try to give these types of stories opportunities in the ways that they wanted to bankroll other stories.
Francisco, ¿puedes
Sí.
compartir?
Yeah. Thank you very much, Adia, Dr. Adia. Just to mention what Andres was worried, it is a universal stigma. Everywhere in the world, they look suspicious, our dear countryman from African roots. It's a worldwide stigma, and it makes me really think that people are very egoistic. But my question is, when this little footnote, very common in the US when they were recruiting, this is a company which is recruiting everybody. It doesn't come anymore. You know, there was always a footnote in the announcement which said this is a company, let's say in other words, which is not discriminating. And the last one is about the globalization. Why in the US they didn't recruit worldwide like it is very common in other countries?
Yeah, that's an
Thank you
interesting.
very much.
Oh yes, thank you for the question. That's an interesting one. I think this question of recruitment and whether it occurs on a global level depends on both the industry and the company in question. For example, in the finance industry, and I include a worker from the finance industry in the book, I think that is an area where we are more likely to see more international recruitment, particularly because the financial world is so global and so interconnected that there is a perspective that people with roots or origins in other countries may be better able to tap into those markets than people who are less international in focus. But when I think about Kevin, who was one of the examples that I included here in the book, who's working at a small nonprofit, that's not a company that's likely to have the same type of international reach and to recruit as internationally. They were much more likely to recruit locally because they were smaller, two, they just simply didn't have the budget for international recruitment, and three, I think their focus on redressing educational inequities in the particular city in question meant that local workers would have been more likely to be attractive candidates for jobs there.
I remember now, it is called an equal opportunity employer.
Yes.
And it doesn't come anymore. What has happened?
Yeah, that's a good question. I am not sure if there's been a concerted reason why companies may be less likely to include the footnote or the statement that they are equal opportunity employers. I know many workplaces are consistently trying to adapt to the changing judicial landscape in the United States, and it may be that that is not required anymore, or that they want to make sure that they are not opening themselves up for liability. But I'm not sure if there's been a concerted push or reason why we don't see equal opportunity employer listed as much.
Wow. ¿Tienen un comentario, alguna pregunta, por favor? Si pueden ver en el chat, se ha compartido el website de la Universidad de Washington, University in St. Louis. Estamos hablando del medio en la zona central de la Unión Americana. También se ha compartido el website de los programas de posgrado y los centros de investigación, el Centro de Investigación en Humanidades, en Trabajo Social y en Políticas Públicas de la Universidad de Washington, universidad privada de 1853, ¿no? Estamos frente a una institución académica que ya tiene más de un siglo, de 150 años de fundación, y como pueden revisar en varios websites, está entre las 20, 30 primeras de Estados Unidos, de la Unión Americana, en cuanto a apoyo a la investigación, en cuanto a internacionalización, a pesar del hecho que hay tantos centros económicos en Norteamérica, California, Nueva York, Massachusetts, pero han logrado desde Missouri una propuesta académica internacional y global. Aria, please, what is your advice to apply for your university? In general, the applies start in October to December, but in your university, to apply for the master for doctoral programs, what is your advice?
I believe applications open in the fall for graduate study in sociology at Washington University. If you go to the sociology department website, there's a lot more information up there that people can take a look at. But I would encourage anyone who's thinking about graduate studies, certainly apply. We have a great department and we'd love to be able to consider your application.
Aria, in general, in this moment, the people, the university, no? Projects connection with Asia, no? With Pacific area, no? In specific, your university, what is projection to South America? You have experience with Brazil, Argentina, or Pacific University?
Our specific department does not, but the university does have connections with places all over the world. That's just not something that our department is relatively small and a bit new. So we personally do not have connections across the world yet, but the university has connections everywhere.
Well, so your visit could be opportunity for your department and your faculty and university. Peru is a middle economy in the Central Pacific, South Pacific. In Pacific, we have Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and Chile. And these four countries, Peru in this moment is project, no, una developed connection with China, especially with China in commerce. This is people believe, no, in 21st century, the first economy in this region could be the Peruvian. Now it's Chile, but the difference between Chile and Peru is in this moment 10 or 50%. No? The idea is the projection, the Peruvian economy is in increased development. Well, bien, Aria, we project your visit to Lima. I share the Marinera and the Peruvian coast dance. Well, it's your first visit to Lima.
Yes, it will be. I'm very excited.
Well, Peru has a long African tradition. We have contact with the Western Africa. The last year we started an agreement with Ibadan. Ibadan is the oldest university in Nigeria. We have contact with the Senegal, Dakar, capital of Senegal. The last year in our seminar participate and director the Cape Town University, South Africa, Nigeria, and Senegal is no contact with our university. Africa has some experience in St. Mark University. Do you visit Africa? Do you know African scholar?
I have been to some African countries. I can't say that I know any African scholars at this point.
Well, Ibadan is very interesting in develop, no, different transatlantic contact and connection, no, could be opportunity to connect with the Ibadan friends. Well, second, the idea of the seminar is 2 days in, no, share your research and share your next research to the young student and the professor, no, the university in early September.
That sounds great. I look forward to meeting you all and hopefully visiting some of you all then.
Well, amigos, amigas, se proyectaba 1 hora, nos hemos extendido un poquito más. Tenemos muchas gracias por su presencia, por su participación. Cordialmente los invito a la próxima sesión del seminario es el 26 de febrero con la profesora Roberta Cronca. Roberta es miembro de la Facultad de Arquitectura en la Universidad de Sao Paulo. Ella dirige un grupo de investigación de estudios urbanos en América Latina, ¿no? Que conecta no solo arte, sino también ciencias, ¿no? Entonces, también para Roberta será la primera vez estar en contacto con San Marcos, recordándoles que a fin de mes vamos a recibir la visita de un grupo de estudiantes de Sao Paulo que tienen un programa de Sao Paulo hacia Perú, de varias áreas académicas y bueno, pensando también en incrementar relaciones con muchas universidades. Estamos ahora con Washington University en San Luis, pero también estamos con universidades del sur como Sao Paulo University. Well, Adia, thank you for your help, your time, and the idea is to think how to help the people, no, help the young student. I sure your student in your department could be a good experience in Lima. For example, before pandemic, we had a seminar with the Maryland University, the poverty in Baltimore and Lima and Baltimore. The comparison between the poverty in urban areas, no? I'm sure we can find some topic to connect San Luis in Lima, San Luis. Not only the African social process, it could be the American in general, no? The other, the Native American, no? The original people of America could be interested to see connection with the university. In Peru, we have experience in intercultural universities, no? The contact with the original nation in university could be a experience to talk between San Luis and Lima and the other aspect.
Thank you. I look forward to meeting everyone, or hopefully meeting some of you in September during my visit then.
Well, amigos, amigas, muchas gracias por su presencia. Cordialmente les reitero la invitación el 26 en la mañana con la profesora Roberta Cronca de la Universidad de Sao Paulo. Y en marzo tenemos una actividad con la Universidad de Indonesia. Es la primera universidad de Indonesia, Gadjah Mada. Indonesia es parte del G20, es una gran economía y a pesar de la distancia, son más de 10 horas. Va a ser en la mañana temprano. Son 12 horas entre Yakarta y Lima, Perú. Va a ser 8 de la noche, 8:30 de la noche de Yakarta, 8:30 de la mañana en Lima, Perú. Y nos va a acompañar una colega, Wendy Meng, que es actualmente vicerrectora de la universidad. Muy entusiasta también en estar en contacto con Sudamérica. Y en marzo tenemos, además de Gadjah Mada, otras universidades en Europa y América. La idea es tratar de sensibilizarnos con las distintas propuestas académicas y estar atentos a distintas oportunidades que se puedan desarrollar, ¿no? Con estas universidades, ¿no? Vecinas, pero también distantes. Muchas gracias por su presencia. Adia, well, see you September.
Sounds good. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day. Bye-bye.
It's been a pleasure, ma'am.
Saludos, muchas gracias.
Profesor, disculpe, para la foto.
Please, please. Adia, can you hear me? Oh, please.
I think she already disconnected. Creo que
Ya,
ya se desconectó,
a ver,
profesor.
sí, voy a ver si la contacto un momento, un momento.
Ujú.
Héctor, ¿no tienen la posibilidad de instalar ese traductor simultáneo?
Consulta al BRA, un momento. Sí, tienes razón. A ver, le he pasado la solicitud a la profesora un momento, ¿ya? Ever, ¿me escuchas, Ever?
Sí, sí, sí lo escucho.
Bueno, el tema es ver si entre los aplicativos está el traductor simultáneo. Aunque hay un traductor simultáneo y se ha aplicado, pero la traducción no es tan exacta y tiende, si se lo sigue, tiende a desordenar al que está acompañando.
Pero
Este trau-
algo es algo, porque es difícil traducir el 100% de lo que dice. Es mejor que se utilice algún tipo de traducción. Los traductores son muy buenos, porque si no, resulta que usted, señor, sabe que en Sudamérica no se habla pues idioma extranjero. Entonces se pierde mucho el valor de la conferencia. Y son temas muy importantes, ¿no? Pero averíguenlo y entrénenlo, porque es posible que ayude, o al menos para la grabación, ¿no?
Correcto, correcto. Muchas gracias por tu aporte, Francisco. A ver, esperamos un momento. Bueno, fue algo rápido lo de Adia. Un momento, ¿ya? Bueno, por favor, ¿podrían prender todo su cámara para tomar una toma de la sesión y ya compartirla? Sí, por favor.
Aún tengo el problema en que mi computadora no tiene para cámara.
Entiendo, Andrés. Amigos, amigas, ¿podrían prender su cámara, por favor, para tomar una impresión de la reunión?
Tres, dos, uno. Listo, gracias.
Muchas gracias a todos. Entonces, espero que nos puedan acompañar la próxima semana con la conferencia de la profesora Roberta Cronca.
Ahí estaré.
Urbanismo estudios de urbanismo en la Universidad de Sao Paulo. Ella es arquitecta, pero trata de vincular, ¿no?, distintas áreas en el estudio del urbano. Muchas gracias por su presencia y estamos en contacto.
Hasta luego con todos. Que les vaya bien.
Hasta luego.